In 1883, an ancient Egyptian mummy arrived at Cornell University. Analysis of human remains such as these can tell us a lot about the individuals and about the times and cultures in which they lived. What I want to focus on today, though, is the story of this particular individual's life, if you will, after his arrival at Cornell in 1884. My name is Frederick Gleach. I curate the anthropology collections here at Cornell. I'm not an Egyptologist, but I have the benefit of prior work that's been done by people who know a lot more about ancient Egypt than I do, and so I have this information that I can share about these objects that are in my care. When the mummy arrived in 1884, as was pretty much the practice at that time, they got together and they held an unwrapping. And there was an account published in the Cornell Daily Sun, the student newspaper, that describes the unwrapping. The body was found to be enveloped in a dark red shroud. Beneath this were the linen bandages in strips about 4 inches wide, wound closely and neatly about the body. Some time was occupied in removing these, during which the audience sat in a state of eager expectancy, awaiting the exposure of the head and shoulders. When brought to light, the features were found in a rather poor state of preservation, even for a mummy. A stubby beard upon the chin was the principal object of interest, and was feelingly touched by most of those present as they passed by. After the unwrapping was completed, it was found that the body measured 5 feet 6 inches in length, and was thus somewhat above the average height. The viscera, which had been removed, were wrapped separately and had been packed between the limbs of the mummy. A number of beetles were found in the folds of the bandages, which upon inspection proved to be of recent origin. The body, with its wrappings and case, will be at once placed on exhibition in the large hall of the museum. The museum referenced here was the University Museum, which is in many ways the predecessor of the anthropology collections today. The mummy had been recovered in excavations in Thebes in 1883, the previous year before he came to Cornell. And we know from readings of the inscriptions on the sarcophagus that were done by an Egyptologist at that time that his name was Penpi and he was a scribe. Later analysis revealed that he was in his 20s to early 30s, but beyond that we don't really know a whole lot about Penpi, the person. By the 1930s, the body was taken off display in the University Museum and put in storage up in the attic of McGraw Hall. It stayed there for at least a couple of decades. We know it was still there in the 1950s because there are references by alumni from that period. But at some point, probably in the 1960s, it was transferred to the Art Museum and again put in storage. Now, at that time, the Art Museum was in the A.D. White House, our original president's house. And the sarcophagi were put in storage in the basement of that house. There are 2 sarcophagi that accompanied the mummy. One is the outer wooden sarcophagus, which is here beside me right now. The other was the inner cartonnage sarcophagus, which was inside this one. The wooden sarcophagus survived in relatively good condition during its stay in the basement of the A.D. White House, but the cartonnage one suffered considerable damage. Cartonnage is essentially papier-mâché, but in the case of cartonnage, with strips of linen cloth replacing the torn strips of paper that are typically used in papier-mâché. In the moist climate of the basement of the A.D. White House, the plaster of Paris in the cartonnage softened, and it had been stored standing on its feet, leaning against the wall in the basement. We know that because of the damage that it suffered as a result of the softening plaster. You can see the feet are curled up, collapsed under the weight of the sarcophagus itself. The chest and face are flattened where they leaned against the wall, and the paint is missing where it presumably peeled off when it was removed from that location. When I first arrived here in the 1990s, there had been further insult done to this sarcophagus, this representation of a person, in that someone had put a cigarette out in his face. And so there was a cigarette butt left in the destroyed face of the cartonnage sarcophagus. We have, of course, removed that and cleaned it as best we can without causing further damage to the flaking paint and fabric and so forth. An art conservator, of course, could restore that sarcophagus, but there are a couple of problems with doing that. One, the cost of that work would be significantly higher than we can afford. And second, the resulting restored sarcophagus would have a financial value of significantly less than what it would cost to do the work, to restore it. So in sheer economic terms, it doesn't really make much sense to do that. It also doesn't make much sense for pedagogical purposes. This is a teaching collection, and seeing the damage that was done to this sarcophagus offers a couple of advantages for pedagogical purposes. First, it'll let you see the construction of the sarcophagus very clearly. You can see the layers of linen cloth, you can see the plaster, you can see the pigment on the surface of the plaster. Second, it really drives home, by seeing this damage, how even institutions full of smart people can do really stupid things sometimes and result in significant damage to objects. This is a very important lesson for curators to keep in mind. Everything we do has consequences. Every time we display an object, we photograph an object, we handle an object, we open a drawer, there is the risk of some damage happening to that object. And of course, I could tell the story of the damaged sarcophagus even if it were restored, but it wouldn't have the same presence as being able to actually see that damage and experience just what a horrible thing was done. Not through any intention, not out of any malice, but just by not thinking about what the possible consequences might be of storing this in a damp basement standing on its feet. The body of Penpi itself suffered further indignities. In the 1960s, it was defleshed. This was done without any approval or permission by any of the authorities in the department, in the college, in the university. So what we have today are the disarticulated, defleshed bones of this scribe, Penpi. Now, this too offers certain pedagogical advantages. We can actually see the bones and examine them for any possible signs of disease, injury, tooth wear, anything of this sort. But I don't think anyone would argue that this is an ideal state, that it was an ideal way for human remains to be treated. The treatment of human remains in museums, in anthropological collections, has changed over the last half century or so. When I was growing up in Virginia, the remains of an Egyptian mummy were on display in the art museum there. They are no longer on display there. There was a time when the remains of Penpi were on display in the University Museum here. More recently, they would sometimes be put out for students to examine in classes in a sort of a general setting. We don't do that anymore. The current accepted practice is to let human remains rest, to not put them out on public display, to not bother them, unless there's good analytical purpose in doing so. And of course, one has to be sensitive to cultural questions as well. The descendant communities of some human remains object strenuously to having those remains subjected to analysis. Some other descendant communities are much more open to this sort of thing. And so we really have to think about this on a case-by-case basis and evaluate any possible request for using human remains against what the intention of the original person or people, the original culture were, or what our best estimates of them might have been, and against the changing climate in the world today. Visitors often ask about repatriation of Penpi and other objects. And it's a situation that, again, is evolving. But at least as of today, there is no real interest in Egypt in having every mummy that's out there in the world returned, every piece of ancient Egyptian archaeological materials. There are millions of pieces. There are thousands of mummies that are spread around the world. And returning them all would place serious demands for infrastructure, staffing, maintenance to keep those in Egypt. So as of today, to the best of my knowledge, the Egyptian government is happy with professional institutions like Cornell University maintaining collections of this sort with the expectation that we'll do our best to keep them in good condition. Not to do the kinds of things that were done in the 1950s and 60s in this particular instance, for example. And so I try to see that they're taken care of as best as possible.